Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining. We're going to get started here in just a minute. I know, give people some time to jump over from their last meeting to this one, and then I think we're going to get the live stream up and running through all the various different channels that people check us out. So YouTube's getting up and LinkedIn's getting up, and so we're getting started really soon. Thanks for joining. I'll be right back. All right, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Today's session, we're going to be talking about CockroachDB Serverless, something that, well, internally here at Cockroach Labs, we've been talking about for quite some time, but externally, something that we've been talking about for, oh gosh, I think just about a week now. I feel like it's been a month and a half, but it's been about a week, and so we're really excited about this. Today, I'm going to be joined by our CEO, Spencer Kimball, to talk through basically, where this came from and where it's headed, and some of the details of kind of what we've architected here and what we've built. We're pretty excited about this. So, but before we get started, real quickly, this is kind of a, people ask us is what level of depth. This is more beginner to intermediate. Spencer and I are going to talk about, what we've done here, where it's of value, how it's to be used. We're going to get a little bit in the architecture as well, and kind of, how we built off of, what we have already been building for, oh gosh, over 6.5 years of Cockroach database, and to really start to innovate these kind of deployment models and how people need to consume a database. And I think, we're going to talk a little bit about the technology as well here as well. So maybe it's a little bit beginner to intermediate. But as always, we would love to have questions from y'all. Please place them into the chat if you joined us on this platform that I'm directly on. But I think there's people monitoring the YouTube stream, and I think LinkedIn as well. So if you have questions, please enter those into those platforms, and we'll make sure to get them answered live. This is an opportunity to ask questions live of our CEO, Spencer, who's pretty advanced in databases and all things distributed, if you will, if you joined us for anything in the past. So, and then before we start, yes, the recording will definitely be available. We stream direct to YouTube, and we get these things out there and available as quick as we possibly can. So, so with that, man, my slides just go fast. So thank you for joining us. We named it, a serverless SQL database for the future of application development. When we put out this advertisement, this kind of, this card. We hadn't released CockroachDB Serverless, and today we're really proud to have launched CockroachDB Serverless and have it out there in the wild, and have people using it. So I'm going to be joined today by Spencer. Spencer, if you want to come on, that'd be great. It's like,
hey, Jim.
Unveil the curtain. Hello, welcome to the show. I can't wait until we're live again soon, dude. These things are much better that way. I think last time we were live, I think we had like a between two ferns type thing, right?
Yeah, I do recall that.
Yeah, it was like I was less Zach Galifianakis than normal, but thanks for joining us today, Spencer. Really excited, y'all. I'm Jim Walker. I'm product marketing. Been on lots of streams here, so I'm just gonna get rid of slides and get into a conversation here. Oops, let me stop sharing screen. Oops. Oh man, like I've never shared a screen before. What's going on here? Stop share. There we go. So Spencer, thanks for joining me today. Yeah, it's been a big week for us as a company. I think it's been a big 2 years for us as a company, right? I think getting this done and kind of getting a new product into the marketplace has been nothing short of kind of astonishing. And to be part of this team, it's been awesome. And I think the reception in the broader kind of developer and audience, the people that we talk to, I think we're well over 1,000 clusters to date on CockroachDB Serverless in just under a week. So I'm just really excited and thankful for everybody out there who's actually gone out and used it, but I'm thankful to everybody in the company. So I don't know. I guess I kind of going to start with like, congratulations, Spencer. How does it make you feel to kind of, start this off and kind of get to this point, right?
Well, it's amazing. I definitely don't think that many congratulations are due to me. It's a huge team behind this effort, and it's made it a reality. But I think you alluded to this a little in your introduction, but this has been quite an investment, and it's a critical step. Both in terms of the particulars of Cockroach and the value proposition and how to actually deliver that to a wider audience, but just in databases more generally.
Yeah.
We're not the first people to imagine databases should be serverless. Amazon, as they often do, have innovated in terms of how to deliver software. They've done that with DynamoDB originally, which is very clearly a serverless database. And they've done it more recently with Aurora. So it's not that we're the first to market, but we are the first to market. Maybe it's not too impressive, but with bringing Cockroach into a serverless, footprint or consumption model. But that's critical for Cockroach because Cockroach's differentiators are very difficult to deliver if you're going to require that everyone owns an entire cluster themselves. Very expensive, very complex. Serverless allows us to give that to everyone. So we realized this maybe 2 years ago that we'd have to move in this direction. And it's, again, this realization that if you look 5 years into the future, this is how everyone's going to consume databases. It's just, it's better. Like the decisions you have to make around capacity planning and where nodes are, and even what clouds and so forth. This is something that you'd like to eliminate. It's really, hey, it's a database. It works wherever you need it. It's as big as you need it to get, so forth. So that's definitely the future. And then just from our personal journey, it's like, well, how do we see Cockroach being brought to a larger audience? And that's been something that we've realized for some time. And yeah, this is a seminal point. It's a milestone for us because you envision that, you realize we actually have some real advantages to making a serverless database, but it's also an absolute requirement for us. So, that 2 years ago to really a very concentrated year of effort, most recently, to have that actually come to fruition. And again, it's just the first iteration. It's a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, and I think, Spencer, when we first met, it was like 4 or 5 years ago, I think now, which seems ages ago. To build on top of what we already have, right? Like Cockroach itself is pretty unique in terms of the database. I mean, the entire approach to basically architect from the ground up is kind of remarkable in terms of like being truly cloud native, but, built for this kind of new type of infrastructure and whatnot. I think we've had a couple seminal moments. I think getting customers to use that, I think having CockroachDB dedicated and the cloud version, right? A managed version of this, I think was also a really big moment. This one to me is a little bit bigger than others, I think, because this redefines consumption, right? As you said, right? This is a wholly different way of thinking about things, and I think builds on top of scale that can go anywhere, right? Like, and I don't think about scale just in a single data center. When I think about serverless, I don't know, man. If you're going to remove servers, then let's remove AZs, let's remove regions, let's go global, right? And I think that's kind of one of those things. Building on top of that, it's just awesome. So let me just start with like the easiest question of all, Spencer. And I'm a product marketer, so I've probably written what is CockroachDB Serverless about, I don't know, 11 times over the last like 3 weeks. So me and the team, how do you describe it? Like, what is CockroachDB Serverless at the highest level? We'll talk about value and some of the things, but how do you describe it to somebody?
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple critical earmarks of anything that you're going to call serverless, but the name itself suggests the most basic attribute, which is that from the user's perspective, you're not dealing with the typical concept of a server, right? And that has real value because dealing with the typical concept of a server requires a lot of specialized knowledge. So if you think about deploying a database in the kind of 2015 era for Cockroach, this is an open source product. So you had to own the server. Maybe you had one lying around, or you could just dial one up on GCP or AWS. You got to choose, what's the right version of the operating system. If you're in production, you got to think about how to upgrade that and make sure you have all the right patches and so forth. Then you're saying, how big should this server be? What kind of disk do I need to attach to it? Can it be just a persistent SSD? Do I not need that kind of performance? I could just try to do something cheaper that's really spinning disk. That's maybe not a decision people are making too often. Should it be attached storage like EBS that actually has its own replication inherent in it, or persistent SSD and GCP? There's like lots of different options. And then how many IOPS do I need if it's one of these shared disks and so forth? Okay, now we're talking about Cockroach, right? So Cockroach, one of its salient characteristics is that it's a very resilient architecture, and you can replicate just sort of at a base level. You'd want to replicate at least across availability zones within a region. Okay, which region? Which availability zones are appropriate? Are there differences in price? Do I want to go cross region? There's just a lot of decisions you want to make, as opposed to saying, as a very different example, how survivable do I want this to be? Do I want to be able to survive an availability zone outage or a region outage? That's like a really nice question to ask. And it's very different from saying, okay, you can basically build anything, and you're going to have to allocate the servers in all these different locations and choose all kinds of different configuration options in order to then install the software, keep Cockroach up to a recent version, and manage that all yourself, probably with Kubernetes. And not Kubernetes is something even more difficult, although Kubernetes is its own can of worms. So what we're saying is, there's a brave new world. It's not just us saying it, obviously, but given that, I've only described the sort of tip of the iceberg of complexity of Cockroach. If you really start to say, we want to actually do multiple regions and partition the data and have global tables, right? Once you really start to embrace all that complexity, doing it all yourself is a complex undertaking, and that's going to require time and also resources. And that's the other really fascinating thing about serverless. There's a big opportunity to make the utilization of resources more efficient, and therefore we can lower the cost of actually running Cockroach. But there's also the cost of, hey, I got to learn how to run this. I got to learn how to, decide what to do with EC2 and EBS and the AWS context. And it's different in GCP, and it's different in Azure and all these things, different in a private data center, of course. But we're trying to say we can allow a developer to not ignore those things. That's not really the point, but how do we just get to the point of building an application on top of a database and not have to make all those decisions, at least not up front? You can kind of delve into them in various ways down the road when it becomes topical, but up front, I understand developers' mindset because I was a developer for most of my career. And when you actually are trying to build something, like something that's going to be a backend to support a mobile app, you just want to get something done, right? Yeah, you worry about some of the future scalability and so forth, but it's time to value. It's like, how could I just solve this? And so what we're saying is, let's take this serverless approach that was pioneered, I'd say, with execution layers. Like, people are very familiar with Lambda as a kind of canonical example of serverless. But the idea here is just, let's focus on what we actually need to build and let somebody else take care of as many details as possible. Started off with a managed service for Cockroach. Serverless goes even a step further because it says, make no decisions about how this thing's going to be run in practice. We're going to create this wonderful abstraction layer. You just build what you need on top of the database, and the database for you is just a SQL API. And then, then you push your application to production. The database is just there to serve it. If your application starts getting a lot of utilization, and you say, oh, we better create multiple pods that are running my application server, which is a Docker container or something like that. And you're running this on Cloud Run on Google or Fargate on AWS. Like, you just create as many of those as you need. The database just gets bigger. You're not saying, hey, I need to add nodes. I need them to be this big and so forth. Or I don't have enough IOPS for my storage. That just all works. The database gets as big as it needs to get to service your application. And you kind of set what's the sort of survivability that you want. And down the road, we want to make it so that it's even easy to do things like, hey, I'd actually like to use Fargate, but I want to also use GCP because GCP runs best in Northwestern Europe. So I'm going to put some things on Google Cloud Run. It's the same application server, but now I'm using some Google. Can the database just span the two clouds? We don't do that yet, but at some point you kind of, what is serverless? It's like, how do I remove all the decisions? If your application traffic is coming from Google's cloud, what can you put the data that it needs in closer to it so that the costs are less expensive? Do I want to move to expand my customer base to Brazil? Right. Well, can the database just sort of transparently support storing data in Brazil? So that it's low latency for those Brazilian customers and even you can keep their data in their jurisdiction if it's PII data and things like that. So it's kind of like, how do we make the developer's life as simple as possible? And serverless, right? Getting rid of the servers is a big step in that direction.
So I got to tell you, Spencer, like 30-year-old Jim, like a while back, would say amen and thank you, Jesus, because I hated dealing with all this stuff. Like this is, I wanted to focus on business logic. And I think that's exactly what this is, right? Like code against an API, have endpoints all over the planet if you need them, or have an endpoint in your local, wherever you want to actually work, right? Like, I think the vision is exactly right. It's, you know, like, is service right for, you know, we talked about, you talked about a couple different like types of applications and expanding to global and everything else. What applications are right for something that's like serverless database? Like, what do you feel is like the sweet spot for that? And is it just every application?
Well, it's not every application yet for us, but in the future, right. Yes, it will be. I think that's just the absolute future consumption mode, because there's nothing about serverless that says that it can't get arbitrarily powerful and massively scaled and globally, geographically scaled. Like there might be practical differences between CockroachDB Serverless in October 2021 and CockroachDB dedicated, right? There are, in fact. There's some caveats. We don't support everything in serverless that we do, right? But in the future, that's absolutely going to be the case. And the beauty of serverless is that, for those that don't want to deal with the minutia of running the database themselves, or even choosing all these kind of more involved sort of infrastructure choices. Mm-hmm. Number of nodes, size of nodes, where the nodes located, how's the attached storage and so forth. We expose a lot of that in dedicated. But for those that would prefer just to build what they're building and get that done as quickly as possible by just iterating on their business use case, serverless is a huge step forward. Yeah. Now, like but it's very important to realize that there's a lot of different kinds of developers out there, right? And some actually very much operate either in a context or with a personal preference for running the database themselves fully. So that's where you'd use self-hosted Cockroach or the open source version of Cockroach. And there's other developers that, really, it's very important, let's say they work at a big bank or something, that if they're going to use a managed service, which is what they prefer to use, it really needs to be dedicated. It can't be, the serverless footprint that we currently support doesn't work for that, right? But I think right now, where serverless has the best sort of fit for application use cases are where it's a new start, yep, or a hobby project or a hackathon project. But I think the new start is probably the most interesting from my perspective. If you're going to do a startup, serverless is wonderful because there's a free tier. You don't have to put your credit card in. You can create a bunch of test clusters, pre-production stuff before you launch. Then you launch, you create your first launch cluster. If anyone's done a startup, it's often the case. You have this great idea, you build, your mobile app or your web application or both, and you get your backend. And you don't want that to take too long because you really want to get to the point where you fail fast and you get some information from the market. So you launch something. Okay, just dial another serverless cluster. This is also free. I still haven't even put a credit card in, right? And you can use the free tiers of Amazon's Lambda and Fargate and Google's Cloud Run and GCF. So you actually don't really, in Cockroach, you don't have to put down a credit card. You do in the clouds, but you actually can use these free tiers. And you can build a pretty sophisticated service that's quite scalable. And it's still like, let me just give you some numbers. With Google, it's something like 250 million request units a month that you get for free. With Cloud Run and Google, you can actually have something like a million requests a day or something like that, that are essentially just think about any application stack that you want to support, because it's really just a container running. It's an arbitrary thing. That's a lot in terms of capacity. You can do any startup I've ever done in those initial stages before you get a lot of users into it. You can, you'd be well under those limits. So think about that from the days I started with startups back in the late 90s, in the .com boom. We had to put machines into co-located data centers, and we installed the machines onto racks. And the cost in order to get there was tremendous. And it wasn't, believe me, just the dollars and cents, which was painful enough. was the fact that you had to be in data centers and like screwing things in and knowing how to be a system administrator and doing all the DevOps yourself with tools that were nothing like today. Now you can skip all of that and just be like, what are we trying to build? And that's it. And that's beautiful. So the new starts are I think the sweet spot for Cockroach serverless, and that's where I'd be.
Yeah, and I think, Spencer, we had talked about that a lot as we were coming through the launch of this and like thinking about fractional clusters and like, okay, look I just need a little bit so I can build. And I think that's exactly right. And I think the tools that people have today, personally, I think there's this whole next generation of startups that will think about disruption in a different way because they can do this. And you could do it almost for free, basically. And I think that's such a big deal. In fact, we were playing in the Bug Bash a couple of weeks ago. I went and I used one of these low-code platforms, Retool, and I built an app on Retool, and like sure enough, I just used Postgres drivers connected to serverless, and I had an app up and running in about, I don't know, it was like 7 minutes or something. Like so, I mean, we're talking about, I haven't coded for real in a long time. Did I code? I basically just built something from scratch, right? And like that level of ease and that level of not having to deal with things, I think we're just going to see the advent of a whole lot of really interesting things, because I think any idea could come to light now, because I think we're removing the obstacles. And I think that's the coolest part.
You touched on something really interesting, because there's the idea of moving from server full to serverless, which is a big win, and ultimately I think there's an ability to allow developers to develop the way that they currently do in terms of building their Swing app and using React and Redux and the plethora of new technologies and so forth, like Prisma and Sura, GraphQL, and all these things. You can build whatever it is you want, and I think the real promise of this sort of serverless infrastructure is that whatever you build on your laptop and with your mobile device, once you're ready to put it into production, you upload it up there and it will scale globally. That's the goal, right?
Right.
But even then, you realize there's other ways you can make developers' lives easier. So the time to value is further compressed. You can build more, build faster, get those ideas out there. And that's kind of like, okay, well, all of these amazing tools that we have that make the application development faster, can we boil that down so there's higher level of abstractions where people can spend even less time, as long as they're implementing more common patterns? And that actually might be sort of a critical bit of understanding. Like, why would we have serverless and still have dedicated? Like, why would we have dedicated but still have the idea that you can run Cockroach yourself? It's because the more control you take, the more flexibility you have. So you kind of trade one for the other. And there's no right answer, right?
Right.
Like, is there something wrong with using like a low code platform? Oh, that's just, that's lame. That's not for like real developers. I know some people take that attitude, and I think I have in my younger years about certain kinds of technological advances. But the reality is there's no correct answer. It's like, can you build what you want to build? And how quickly would you like to do that and trade some flexibility?
That's right.
For something where you could put in a bit more of the groundwork yourself, control more layers of the stack, and have much more flexibility. And that's that's ultimately an approach we've taken with Cockroach, which is quite interesting, right? Yeah. We own this stack top to bottom. Oh, go ahead.
No, go, Spencer, please.
I was just going to say, we own the stack of Cockroach top to bottom, from the SQL layer. We own the whole optimizer, all the way down to the very lowest level. We used to use RocksDB, which is something that came out of Google originally as LevelDB, and then Facebook extended it as RocksDB. We found that was actually a critical part of our stack. And so we re-implemented RocksDB as something we call Pebble. Now that we own Pebble, we can do all kinds of fantastical things, because it's like the low-level storage capability. There's things you can hook in at that level that are almost magic if you compare it to what you could do if you can only operate at the layers of abstraction above. So that's an example where we as a company embraced the hardest path, so that we owned everything, so that gave us lots of flexibility. That took a lot of time. It was a big investment, right? Was that the right thing compared to, for example, Amazon that repackages Postgres and MySQL? Well, they don't own the database engines. They can't make that globally scalable. They can sort of make directional movements, but they don't own the whole stack, so it really limits them. But boy, they got to market very fast, and obviously they have a great business with Aurora. And so is there something right or wrong about either of those approaches? No, it's the same thing as if you're going to use a low-code platform where you're going to, write your stuff in, assembly language.
I don't know, dude. Like, somehow I just think I was dissed a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going to go. I think we've come a long way from, allocating memory in C code and, malloc and, collecting garbage ourselves and like, And I think,
and people still do that though, right? Because
people still do it
where like there's an advantage to that. So it's
that's right.
There's no right or wrong, but I love the idea of enabling faster and faster development cycles, and that does seem to be where, over time, that's where the whole industry moves. It's exactly to your point. Like I made the point that maybe people still want to do some hand-coded assembly for like super tight inner loops. That does still exist. But the reality is the world has absolutely moved in the direction of Go and Rust and things like that over time. And there's a reason for it, right? Because, ultimately, if you want to build a startup and get something out there and compete in the marketplace of ideas, it can't take you as long as it would if you don't use these higher level tools.
But what is it like, fast, good, or cheap or whatever, choose two and the whole thing, like, but you're allowed to iterate. Exactly right. I think that's exactly what this does. And like, I think CockroachDB Serverless to me is like, okay, iterate. It's like, oh my God, I have this version of Postgres, but better. Like it's future-proofing me. I can actually expand to, include, it's going to have resilience out of the box. I can scale. It's going to auto scale when I get to that point and I go beyond. I think that's the beauty of this. And that's what gets me the most excited about it, Spencer. But like, technically, we've done a whole lot to Cockroach, right? We've spent 6.5 years building a database that was, it was re-architected from the bottom up to do something very different. When we talk about, to be consistent with a Postgres interface in a distributed environment that's global, that is not a simple thing to do, right? Like that is some rocket science. And, I'll talk to people like, Jesus, like, how did you actually do that? And we built on top of that, right? So what are some of the things that we had to do to Cockroach? And I think it's a little bit of the deployment model. It's a little bit like in the software itself and then kind of how we actually manage this thing. What are the things that we had to do technically to make this happen, Spencer?
Yeah, certainly I can answer that. I can also kind of pick up one of the questions in the chat. The most recent one asked about whether serverless supports geo-partitioning.
Yeah,
it doesn't yet, and that actually will help. But we're very intent on doing it, and that's actually one of the reasons we built serverless, because geo-partitioning can be quite expensive. You want to support. Let me just give you an example. You want to support 5 regions. So just think about Europe, United States, South America, or United States, Canada, North America, South America, Asia Pac. Okay, now that was 4 of them, but let's just say there's 4. So then that's 4 regions. You probably put 3 availability zones in each. So now you're talking about 12 availability zones. Each one has a Kubernetes cluster, which is charged for by the clouds. There's going to be load balancers at each local level. You probably need 2 to 3 VMs per region for various reasons. But so now you're talking about 12 times 2 to 3, so 24 to 36 actual VMs. You need a pretty big use case to use a cluster that big. And a lot of times you would see that maybe you get a lot of usage in the United States, but it's just very light usage in Australia until that market starts to come online. So supporting and all that, you're going to waste a lot of resources and so forth. And just the initial cost structure to support all that would be out of the range of anyone except for a very, very committed, bigger use case. So, a developer that's trying to do a startup would never start there. But there's an opportunity to actually bridge that gap with serverless, because serverless allows us to very efficiently use resources. So we can have, the way to think about it is Cockroach Labs can run a physical cluster that's completely supports geo-partitioning because it's actually spread across multiple regions. It's a very large cluster physically. But what we do is we say every one of these serverless clusters that is hosted on this larger physical cluster is taking a sort of fractional slice of that, which can be extraordinarily fine grained. So if there's literally one piece of data stored in each region, that's all it costs. That's all it's using. On the other hand, if it needs to get very, very large, let's say you've got 10,000 of these serverless clusters inside that physical cluster, one of them, or some handful of them, or some percentage, could get very, very large in that footprint, much larger than you would ever be able to support on a single node database, for example. So it's kind of like you get that incredible flexibility within that footprint. What we realized, to answer your question, is that there were so many aspects of Cockroach, since it was designed as a distributed system that can scale this way, that would support this kind of elastic scalability within a serverless footprint. And what we realize is that we had a great base to build on, but there were going to be a number of things that needed to be changed in order to really realize it. And just to give you I'd say a list, probably in priority order, the biggest was multi-tenancy. So Cockroach was initially conceived of as having a single tenant. Yeah, you can use multiple databases, you can set up roles and permissions, all that exists just like it does in any other relational database. But multi-tenancy is a bit more advanced than that. It really contemplates the idea that, yeah, it's not just multiple databases within a cluster, it's multiple clusters within a larger physical host cluster. And each one of those clusters looks like it's completely isolated. So that means that you can never, you have to architect things so that it is absolutely impossible for one of these clusters to see another, even though they're sharing some of the underlying storage. And so there's various ways that you set that up, but that was a big part of the design space. How do we make that isolation work? Because it's not just isolation in terms of security and what you may or may not be able to see of someone else's data. You want to make that sort of by principle impossible. There's
Right.
obviously the chance that bugs and so forth could happen, but you designed it as much as you can so that there's just all the classes of bugs you can imagine are obviated because just of the way that you set things up. But then you also have the problem of like, what is the actual physical isolation in terms of resources? Like, can one noisy neighbor make everyone else miserable? Right? That definitely happens in a normal database, right? You have somebody, you have 100 databases within the single cluster, and someone starts off a query that does a big full table scan, and it really hoses all the other users of that database. We needed to make that impossible, because if you've got, it's not just random projects or teams within one organization that are using the same database, physical database. Now you're talking about lots of different organizations or independent developers that have no idea, no respect for anyone else. So you really have to control. So that's kind of an idea of sort of rate limiting, distributed rate limiting amongst tenants, and really, there's another part of that, which is accounting. So you understand exactly how much is being used by each, and that actually controls the rate limiting, and ultimately, lets us figure out whether you're under the free tier, if you want to go above the free tier, how much. And so there's all of that stuff had to be added to Cockroach, but just the true distributed nature of it gave us an incredible leg up in terms of realizing that.
Yeah, and I think of that as the moat, if you will, kind of around Cockroach, because I think we were uniquely designed to do this, Spencer. And you talk about rate limiting and accounting and all this stuff. And I think in our first week out, we had a lot of questions around request units and, okay, great. Like, we have a free version of CockroachDB Serverless with up to 5 gig of storage and 250 million request units. You had kind of mentioned that before. Can you give just a sense of what you think like 250 million request units a month is? Like, what kind of the size of the app? Because I know we've talked a lot about it internally. There's been a lot of chatter about it, and I know we posted I think on Hacker News we were front page about this architecture of our database. It's available on our blog if anybody wants to go and read that. Pretty solid post. And there was a lot of back and forth about request units. What is that like? How do you explain this to people? Like, well, it's tough, right? There's a lot underneath, right? I know.
The reality is the request unit is a made up idea, right? It's arbitrary. Right. And there's no way. And by the way, we're not the only ones that have request units.
Oh, right.
Amazon
exactly.
has them for their Aurora serverless. DynamoDB has a concept of them, like reads and writes, and it's also something that applies to Google Spanner and Cloud Spanner. Yep. They also have this like request unit, basically. Fundamentally, I think the right way to think of a request unit is it's like a fairly discrete operation. Like, you're going to select one item from a table or one result set, one item in a result set from a query, but maybe that query touches lots of things. Okay, well, you're probably going to have to use a request unit for some number of those things that are fanned out and joined together and so forth. It might actually include a list of items, but only so long. But if you just think about a fairly discrete set of simple operations, I think there'd be one request unit per each of those, whether it's a read or a write. Now, the devil's in the details there, but because it's a relational database, sometimes it can be hard to know up front what something's going to cost. So what we've done is we've tried to create extreme pricing transparency where we can. So describing exactly what a request unit is difficult, because one query that can even look like another query might be different enough that it actually is quite a bit more expensive to run it.
Yeah.
It might not use the right index and just read a huge amount of data and so forth, and we have to cost that. But what we do say is that, okay, you get this free amount that's kind of, if you know what a token bucket is, it basically is constantly giving you free request units, and it actually gives you a huge chunk of them that allow you to surge up and use like a bunch of burst capacity, so that you don't just get throttled just because something kind of complicated comes in and needs to be run, or you get a little burst of user activity or whatever. You want that all to work. But then we say, once you put your credit card in because you want to go above that free amount, you can say exactly what your maximum budget is. So that's really nice, right? It's like, okay, I'm willing to pay $10 a day. That's really easy to understand, as opposed to like, I want this many request units, not more like, what does that even mean? Like, I know what $10 is, right? So if I say $10 a day is what my limit is, and I run that for a couple of weeks and things are fine, and then I start getting messages that, hey, your use case is at 80% or 90% or whatever, you might want to increase your limit because it seems to be the trend's going up, or you notice that your thing's being throttled. So things get slow in your system as you get a lot of activity. Then you say, okay, well, maybe I should spend $20 a month. So you can kind of set that and be comfortable with it and never get a surprise bill. So I think making something that's going to be completely understandable from a request unit is an impossible task, but making it so that you at least understand what your spend is going to be in the worst case is very easy to understand. And I think at the point where your spend limits are starting to get reached, it's a very easy decision to say, well, this is getting reached because my thing's getting used.
Right.
So how valuable is that to me? Do I want to allow another $10 a day to get charged to this because I'd like to increase my user base because there's value in that to me. But you asked how much 250 million request units are. I think we're going to get a lot more color about that as we go, and we're going to be able to put some really motivating examples. Like, for example, how much is a TPCC? This is maybe not the best example, but TPCC is like a benchmarking framework really for relational databases, and it simulates a sort of an order taking application, and essentially it generates a mix of transactions and queries and things that's supposed to look relatively real world, and it scales depending on how many users and how many what they call warehouses the system is using. So you could say, how much does the free tier support in TPCC? I think, for some people that would actually be like, oh, okay, I have some idea of what that is. I will just say this, like the free tier is meant to be quite generous. So, if somebody is doing a hackathon project that can't live in the free tier, then it's probably not generous enough. I mean, maybe there's some hackathon projects that are insane, but typically you want this to support like easily 1,000 users using your system actively in a day. It depends on again, like what's the transaction mix, but it's a lot, right? You should be able to go from 0 to something where you're actually getting a good signal from whatever your potential market is, and that's the goal here. Like, how can we get developers off to the races without requiring a credit card?
Yeah, and I think, Spencer, I mean, what we've done is this is it does still have the beta tag, like we spoke about. We want feature parity with everything else that we have. I think we're building towards that. Getting this out there and getting in the hands of people so they can actually experience what our use are and how to actually do this is a huge value. I mean, we'll publish a lot more on this over the next couple of months, y'all, like to help people understand what these things are. To me, it's the value of abstracting out IOPS and compute and network, and like, I don't even have to think about that anymore. It's consolidated down. Yeah, how much do you trust the vendor to do that? Well, we're trying to do it in a way I think is transparent as possible, right? Because this is, everybody else does this. It's a fairly complex concept, but to what I think is just phenomenal and remarkable is the spend limits, honestly, Spencer. Like, and what the team has done, I mean, and Lakshmi as product manager, Andy is, building from the engineering, like to actually have that consumption model. When I first read about it internally, I was like, that's brilliant. Because I think that's what people are worried about. They don't want to start this serverless thing. Like, I've seen too many serverless compute platforms or too many complaints, let's say, in Reddit or Stack Overflow or whatever, where people are like, well, I had the serverless thing on, it just went for like 4 days. And like, I was
honestly, it's not
10 grand, right.
It's the whole cloud experience. I mean, if you've been using cloud for some, for any non-trivial usage, you've had a surprise bill, right? And you're like, whoa, what is this?
Right.
Like, I didn't realize I left that thing on or whatever. And what am I going to do? Yeah.
Hey,
So that's not unusual.
I love this auto scale thing. It auto
Yeah.
scaled and it drilled my
It
wallet.
auto scales. Yeah, exactly. Well, and also you want it to auto scale up and auto scale down.
Right.
Yeah, the spending limit is a nice innovation for sure. And I imagine that market's going to move in that direction because ultimately better products make people's lives easier and better, not just charge them random things because you can.
Yeah, this comes at like kind of, I want to wrap up and kind of talk about the future a little bit as well, Spencer, right? And like, where does this kind of take Cockroach Labs and not just us, but I feel like the database market, because I've been in data for a while, you've been in data for a while. This is a fundamentally different kind of approach. And I think, there's others that are kind of knocking on this door. There seems to be, directionally, it seems that many are coming this way. From a database, like just general, like serverless database market, what does this mean? I think we should talk about, I'm sure you're going to talk about CockroachDB in the context of that as well. But like, where do we go with this, right? Like, let's say we get to feature parity with, exactly what's in CockroachDB dedicated, the cloud version of this. Where does this go?
It's a good question. Certainly that feature parity is important. Someone did ask the question about geo-partitioning. This is, honestly, we built serverless. The primary motivator originally, and it's gotten much bigger than this, but the primary motivator was like, how do we give geo-partitioning to everyone? Yeah. And I mentioned the cost. It can be prohibitive if you're going to own all of the nodes in a cluster. Instead, we're going to be able to efficiently share them. So that bringing that to market, I think, is going to be a big chunk of the future. What was really fascinating about serverless is there's lots of ways and lots of flavors of it to imagine. So right now, what we've just released is serverless that applies to any developer out there that wants to come and sort of use this public CockroachDB serverless product and build anything they want on it. And you don't really know who you're sharing that with. It's public, right? It's not like behind a VPC, peered security envelope. Now, where Cockroach has really succeeded in the market to date is with some of the world's largest companies. And many of them are running self-hosted. They're starting to move to using Cockroach dedicated. But you start to realize that what we're building for serverless consumption is also very appealing at the high end of the market. Because a big bank, for example, that's running Cockroach internally for production applications, they've got lots of developers. Right? They might have hundreds of thousands of them in some of these cases. And they're all on different teams and they're doing different things. Sometimes they're doing hackathon projects. They're trying to build, they want to move fast. If you are able to bring that serverless consumption model that's right now only available to developers out there that sign up or use their GitHub OAuth or whatever, it's very public. And you can provide that as an internal consumption model for one of these, let's say a big customer like a bank. That means their internal developers and teams are also accelerated the same way we're doing that externally for developers on some more individual basis. So, there's just that incredible low friction. How quickly can you start? How many of these clusters can you use a day? One really cool thing is, do they look like the production environment? That's very unusual, right? Because a production environment can often be quite expensive. Let's say, 2 regions or 3 regions spread across different availability zones. Often you won't do large scale testing in a footprint that looks like production because it's just too expensive. Nobody wants to set it up. With serverless, you can get 10,000 of those clusters, right? And they look exactly like production. So you actually have high fidelity with your production use cases. Also, in any organization, you build things internally for internal audiences, little one-off apps, little tools and things. You build things for external audiences that might not have very much usage yet. You would like to efficiently use those resources. Yeah. So serverless is another great option here, even for production use cases, because you're actually able to efficiently and with great isolation share the underlying resources. And sometimes that means that some things are popular while other things aren't. So the peaks and the troughs balance. And other times it's like, you know what, this use case is never going to use more than a fraction of a single node. And I have to keep using single nodes for them. Well, with serverless, you can actually efficiently use, share the underlying resources. So that's some of the future directions. Yeah, all very exciting. But the beauty of serverless is that, it doesn't just apply where we've launched it. It applies across all of the different segments of customers we have.
Yeah, and just this efficiency of having a fractional cluster, which looks like production, actually is production because it's just going to scale. The benefits of that are so tremendous, Spencer, like internally in an organization. And I always think about consumption as well. Isn't the consumption model that's built into this just a chargeback model to a department, right? Like, so there's some central, and like, I think that the value like in the macro level for every developer on the planet to run a free database and have this serverless thing, awesome. On that kind of internal, inside the four walls of an organization, I just find that to be truly tremendous. I mean, ultimately, last question. I think there were a couple of questions. Last kind of general question, Spencer. Again, when I met you a while back, I think the vision of the company was make data easy. And I'm sorry, but I come from like enterprise data companies and like, holy shit, man, data is never easy. Like, I'm sorry, it's never easy. Does this deliver on that? I mean, I think it's like make data easy for developers, right? Like, do you feel like have we reached that level?
Well, I think a mission should be pretty evergreen, right? You only ever get asymptotically close to it, and then you realize, oh my God, now we see that we can make it so much easier if we did these other things. You realize how far you are away from actually realizing that goal. It's kind of like climbing mountains and realizing that there's mountains that are much higher than the mountain you just got to the top of, and you've got a long way to go. So that applies, but this definitely takes us a step further. I mean, this is as I said earlier, it's a milestone, and we can build on this just like we initially spent many years building the core value proposition of what is a cloud native relational database look like if you actually build it, not cobble it together and make all kinds of fast to market, but ultimately limiting compromises in the design. So, this is another hefty investment, but ultimately it's unlocking larger audiences for us and ultimately faster time to value at the top end of the market and at the very early starts in the market.
Yeah, I think it just opens up a whole world of other innovation that can happen for not just us as a company, but for people to think about how they build applications and everything. I think it's the tip of the spear.
Yeah, think less about databases and more about building applications. That I think is the goal. And of course, there's always people, there's a whole spectrum.
That's
people that don't want to know at all about the database. We'd like to support those going forward. And it's not just us. There's obviously lots of other tools that you need to really do that. And there's people that want to care about the database just so that they can really scale and make sure their application's efficient. So they really need to understand a little bit more about how the database works and what they're using. And there's people that really care about the database and they're building like the next world-changing application. This would be, there's lots of examples of that. But as we mentioned no code and low code platforms. The developers of those platforms have to care about databases that way.
That's right.
Yeah. The developers on those platforms, they don't want to care about databases, but you just want to you need to support that whole spectrum. And we have really the goal here is a succession of different flavors of Cockroach that support a developer where they want to put their focus. And so someone asked this question of, how would you use CockroachDB classical versus serverless? I think that is the answer. If you don't want to deal with the database, and that's a good starting point, in my opinion, then use serverless for sure. If you realize that, well, I'm really going to have to care about the database, then the answer might be, well, you're going to use Cockroach dedicated, but you might even want to you might be using a serverless cluster within your dedicated cluster for every one of your customers.
That's right.
It's kind of like a SaaS model where you have complete isolation because you're using Cockroach tenants in the serverless model for every one of your customers. And I think that's a really interesting path to the future. But these things converge. I mentioned these different flavors where you can dig down depending on what your level of interest and your necessary attention is to the database. But I think there's a convergence going forward.
Yeah, it's, I think the tagline for our release was build what you dream and never worry about the database. I'm going to add like ... unless you want to.
Exactly.
Because it's true.
It's true. A good marketing tag, right? Because that is like a dream we're trying to unlock. And it's important to many, many developers to worry less about their database. But yeah, there's also an underlying reality. I mean, Cockroach is very much a database for the incredible power use cases out there. And we're never going to lose that part of our DNA. It's critical.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's a lot of developers out there that really don't want to deal with the database, and should, honestly,
well,
when
that's
when
true.
you're just trying to get something into market.
Well, that's true, Spencer. And I think, look at the last couple of releases, some of the things that we've done, like, simplifying the whole concept of deploying a multi-region database and, figuring out what the DML needs to be for people to do that, to have control over geo-partitioning. But however, if you want to do it in serverless, you want us to automate that, great. Eventually, you're going to have an option to actually be exposed the DML to control where data lives at the row level for each table. And so it's build what you dream, never worry about the database. Unless you want to or you have to. And I think it's true. And I think that's the beauty of there's different deployment methods for each one. The question was perfect, right? Like the question that came in. So
there's some other questions that that have come in that actually we can touch on briefly, because they speak exactly what we're saying about how we can limit the concern around the database for, you kind of want to hold off for a future date when that developer really needs to care about it. Maybe that's when they get incredible scale or their use case has product market fit. But in the meantime, someone asked, can I shed any light on migrating non-relational and even relational data from existing to CockroachDB? Relational data, especially if your application is coded towards Postgres, is actually quite simple to move. And I would say that some of the tools to really automate that are still in the works. But that's a fairly straightforward migration. If you're going from MySQL to Postgres, you're going to change your schema, and you have to change some of the surface area you use that has its own MySQL flavor that has to be translated to the Postgres flavor. With NoSQL, many relational databases these days, including Cockroach, have some functionality that makes that simpler than it would be otherwise. I mean, you don't have to migrate all of what you do to a normalized relational model. We have column types, for example, that are JSON. So if you're moving from a document store, let's say, then you could create a simple schema that has a JSON object as a column. And so you can just put your document right into that, create a primary key, or not actually even have to create a primary key. And you can write, you can create indexes on any aspect of that JSON data. And so that actually can make moving from NoSQL fairly straightforward. And someone also asked if we're building a REST API. I think this is super topical improvement to Cockroach, and we are working on that. I think we're using something called PostREST, something like that. I'm not too aware of all the details, but that is forthcoming shortly. But again, it's kind of like these are all bits of surface area that can decrease the traditional amount of complexity and therefore sort of effort required from the developer by smoothing out edges and on relational and creating some intermediate complementary or alternative paths to using the database instead of like an ORM or using the Postgres driver and so forth to access the database, and sort of simplify, make things more easily accessible from modern stacks. So we're working on all of this.
Yeah, and I think as we go through beta, join our community Slack, give us this input, participate in discussions. I think one of the things that, I like conversations internally with, Andy K, talking through all these things, Spencer. I mean, this is largely driven by feedback from developers in the community, right? Like, so we've gotten a lot of conversations about, what is the REST API going to look like? Take part in the conversation is what I think we should tell everybody to, right? Like if you're having those questions, I mean, we're building it, and we're building it for the people who are on this call, listening wherever they're at. And our community Slack is a great place to engage with us, and we're in there all the time. You have a direct input with this company, I think, is another one of those things. This isn't like some big megacorp with like 18 million different services, and you're trying to get in touch. You can get in touch with the team pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, and the public Slack is a direct line in.
Exactly. So sometimes too direct.
Buying a support contract, yeah.
Exactly, right. So
very good for developers out there that have questions like these. There's another part of that REST question. We're definitely building APIs and SDKs so that you can do all the management programmatically as well. That's critical, and it's not part of the first version, but it's coming quickly. It's one of the most requested capabilities.
So there were two other questions, Spencer. I want to wrap up in about 3 minutes. One was about SLA. I'll come back to that. There was another one about how is do we need to know Go language to actually use CockroachDB? Absolutely not. This is any language that you would build on top of Postgres. That's kind of, the database is the database. So we're wire compatible with Postgres. So the same way you would interact, like I said, like I used Retool. I didn't know Go. I know Go, but you know what I mean? So, but what about SLAs? And so, SLAs can go in a lot of different directions, Spencer. Like it's like SLAs for query times, there's SLAs for startup of the cluster, there's SLAs for, restarting a cluster if it went dormant. Like there's lots of different ways. How do you think about that?
Well, some of those we have already paid quite a bit of attention to.
Yeah.
And I think they create important differentiators for CockroachDB Serverless. In particular, if your cluster scales down to 0 because there's just no usage, let's say, a great example of this is you've got a development cluster that, pre-production, and really it's only being used when you've got your, test apps running against it. And maybe people go home for the day and none of that's happening. That cluster will scale down to 0, which is nice. And then, you want that to come back online as soon as someone starts and they get to work the next day. Or let's say that you have a hackathon project and you launch it on the weekend of the hackathon and it gets a decent amount of traffic. And then, it just kind of sits there and someone comes to it a couple of weeks later and tries to hit it. That will be scaled down to 0, but that can start up in like right now, hundreds of milliseconds. So there's an opportunity to move that time even lower.
Yeah.
But that's actually a pretty reasonable SLA for a cold start if you're not getting charged at all until that comes in. By contrast, Aurora serverless takes like 30 seconds or something.
Yeah.
Like that. 30 seconds is absolutely outside of the reasonable bounds for running anything in production. Like no one's gonna click something in a mobile app and wait 30 seconds for it to come back and assume the thing's broken, which effectively it is from a sort of production, response time standpoint. But there's other things. For example, what happens when your serverless cluster is not available? What are the guarantees that we put on that? We haven't worked those out yet. We don't have enough experience with it in production. And right now we're saying that Cockroach serverless is still beta, and that's the reason for it. Right? We need to gain more experience, understand what the sort of operating margins are, so that we can make more of an informed determination about what's appropriate to expect from the service, and therefore what's appropriate to build on it and to trust it for. So that will happen as we go into the general availability release.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be an exciting year, Spencer, and just the next couple of months. Everything we learn about these sort of things, the input we get from the community in terms of what's right, what's wrong, what are the features. Like I said, I can't implore people anymore, take part in our community Slack, because this is a direct insight, not just to the product managers and marketing. This is direct insight it's a direct line into engineering, right, Spencer? I mean, and I think, getting out, using it. It's beta for now. It's pretty good.
It'll be
it's pretty awesome.
It's moving.
It'll be GA pretty fast. Oh my, you said it. There's a lot of work. So it's pretty exciting. So, all right, Spencer, listen, thank you. That was straight up right 1 hour. I really, really appreciate it. I love talking about these things, and live on this kind of thing is just a whole lot of fun. So
it's my pleasure. Thanks for the questions, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for everything and taking the hour out of your day. I know it's tough. So, all right, everybody, have a great, what is today?